Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 77. Jarvis and Pepper. In the end, Jarvis won a number of battles, but lost the war. Given that Yelena had been given food at the same times every day by robotic remote and had not had a visitor after Dr. Xavier, Jarvis did not know how, or to be truthful, if Yelena Belova knew that the Avengers and their associates had left the tower. Whether or not she knew, Yelena Belova began her escape attempt 24 hours, 6 minutes, and 10 seconds after everyone left for Asgard. She timed her attempt for the arrival of one of her meals when, by necessity, the hatch in the bottom of the door was opened. What followed was a 24-hour-long battle between himself and Belova. Jarvis had deployed every security measure the tower possessed, save shooting the woman in the head in an attempt to keep her from escaping. Given that she managed to overcome everything else, Jarvis was not convinced that a bullet to the brain would have stopped her. It would have stalled her escape, perhaps by as much as weeks, since Jarvis refused to believe anyone short of the Hulk could recover from that sort of injury swiftly. But that would have been the best-case scenario. The first 10 hours or so had been a battle between the tower's stock of knockout gas and other tranquilizers, and Yelena Belova's ability to metabolize them and continue trying to escape. Jarvis managed to return her to the cell twice in that period, and she failed to get out of the cell 4 times before succumbing, while she was unconscious before he ran out of the gas and sleep agents. The tower had enough of a supply of both to deal with an attack by normal human agents who would go down and stay down for half a day or more with the application of the gas and tranquilizers. The tower did not, unfortunately, have enough of either to deal with someone who required 3 to 4 times the dose an unenhanced person required, and who could metabolize that dose within an hour or two and refused to stop trying to complete their mission. Still, he was successful in slowing her down and, thankfully, diverting the remaining tower residents, especially the security teams, away from Belova. That meant that at least there were no injuries or fatalities in the tower. The better news was that he was able to inject her with a tracker after adding one to one of the ampoules of sedatives he tried on her early in the escape. Given all that transpired, Jarvis sincerely doubted that she would realize such a thing had been done. He would be able to follow her to her masters now. Sir had warned Jarvis that they would be unlikely to be able to keep Yelena Belova from escaping. Jarvis had, at the time, even agreed with Sir. Still, Jarvis utterly abhorred failing Sir in any particular. He could not quite prevent himself from wondering if her escape was possible only because of some fault in his programming. Thoroughly displeased both with events and himself, Jarvis turned his full attention to the information that Agent Romanov had divulged. This he excelled at, taking incomplete information duly imparted by some source, whether human or electronic, and finding every scrap of further information available from the sources available to him. Ascertaining whether or not the places Agent Romanov had divulged were still in use was the first task, and perhaps the easiest. Tracking power grids and how much power went to which locations was child's play to Jarvis. Disconcertingly, all but the oldest of the locations was still in at least occupational use. Most of the locations had been vacated for a time after Agent Romanov defected, and again when he joined S.H.I.E.L.D. However, when no raids on the locations occurred after at least a year, the locations were put back into use, at least part-time. Jarvis discovered that the oldest of the locations had been abandoned simply because construction in the area damaged or destroyed the locations. The newer facilities were all in areas that saw little to no construction for any of a variety of reasons. Tracking down the people was much more challenging. Jarvis was not for the first time glad that he was not organic and thus did not require sleep. Even at the speeds he was able to operate when it came to obtaining and sorting through information, he required a full 2 days of non-stop work to track down and collate information on the current whereabouts and activities of even a handful of the persons Agent Romanov had been able to name. Even to a non-organic being such as himself, the information Jarvis discovered in the process of developing those dossiers was horrifying. Hydra, despite the deaths of Johann Schmidt and Arnim Zola, was alive and well. Worse, if the data Jarvis had collected was accurate, they had learned, had evolved. Jarvis had no idea as yet as to the scope of the problem, but he knew better than to believe that only a handful of believers in that foul group and their ideology were all that existed. Fortunately, as he was extremely careful, by default, when seeking information, he had not tripped any alarms that he could detect, so for now, Hydra remained unaware that their continued existence had been discovered. Jarvis was reasonably sure that even the capture of Sergeant Barnes did not concern them in that regard. What Jarvis had been able to dig up indicated that they had been careful to keep Hydra-specific items well away from their Winter Soldier, due to it making him unstable faster. Given how often they had wiped Sergeant Barnes's memory, they had every reason to believe that information lost to him, and thus unavailable for retrieval by the Avengers. Captain Rogers was going to be apoplectic. Come to that, Jarvis rather strongly believed that most, if not all, of the Avengers and their associates would be infuriated. Jarvis foresaw a great many missions to eradicate Hydra in the coming days. It was a necessity. Jarvis was quite sure that given what would transpire over the next year as the world prepared for the arrival of Thanos and his army, that Hydra would take advantage wherever possible. All told, Jarvis was extremely relieved when the Bifrost touched down on the roof of the tower and disgorged the majority of those that had left. Miss Potts, I am relieved that you have returned. That is much I must impart. Such was Jarvis's greeting when Pepper walked into the penthouse, the rest of the gang sans Tony, Steve, Thor, Loki, and Barnes trailing behind her. And hadn't Barnes' inclusion in the Around the Realms trip been an interesting discussion? Even Pepper, who had known deaf people in the past, had not known that someone who could not or would not speak could be so expressive and stubborn. Everything else aside, the whole thing had boded well for Barnes' eventual recovery from what he had endured. That said, Pepper hadn't been the only one to be both highly amused and a little heartbroken by the whole thing. Pepper shook off those thoughts and concentrated on the current situation, because she knew there was one. Jarvis was very good at sounding calm and unconcerned. Unfortunately, he had a habit of acting that way only under specific circumstances. It was a remarkably reliable tell for Jarvis being upset and thoroughly convinced that what he had to say would upset her or Tony, or both. She shot a glance at the others. Privacy node necessary, Jarvis? No. Everyone will need to know this information, Jarvis said. Oh boy, definitely not good news. And from the looks on several faces, they knew it too, despite not being familiar with Jarvis and his tone. Everyone found seats. All right, go for it, Jarvis, Pepper said, mentally bracing herself. The first news I must impart is that Yelena Belova has escaped, despite my best attempts to prevent it. I have video if anyone wishes to review it, but I must caution you that it is less than pleasant viewing material. I was, however, able to ensure that no one was hurt or killed during her escape. Well, that's good news. And Jarvis, you knew she'd get loose at some point, and so did we. We're certainly not going to blame you for it happening, Pepper told him. Perhaps if we'd gotten her to one of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s facilities, she'd not have gotten out, but somehow I doubt that. Given the events that occurred during her escape, I find I must concur, Jarvis said. I was able to inject her with a tracker, which she has not yet noticed, and have been following her movements. When she returns to her handlers, we will know where they are currently operating out of. I'll want to look at that video later, Jarvis. Phil spoke up. It will give us a better idea of her capabilities, especially as compared to Natasha. There is, in this instance, potentially quite a difference between the best and second best. Of course, Agent Coulson, Jarvis said. So what else have you got for us, Jarvis? Pepper asked. Yelena escaping would have upset him, but not, she didn't think, quite to the level of upset he seemed to be at. After Yelena Belova's escape, I began an in-depth attempt to track down such persons and places as Agent Romanov divulged to me in her briefing, Jarvis said. The news is not good. Pepper actually glanced toward one of Jarvis's cameras in concern. That flat, almost purely mechanical tone was not good. The last time she'd heard that tone out of him, Tony had disappeared into Afghanistan and Jarvis hadn't been able to find him. That tone was Jarvis doing his level best not to imitate his human creator by flipping out. All but 3 of the locations Agent Romanov gave me are still in use, at least part-time. The 3 that are defunct were damaged or destroyed by nearby construction projects. All of the locations were abandoned for at least a year subsequent to Agent Romanoff defecting from the Red Room, and again when she joined S.H.I.E.L.D. Most were then reclaimed and used, given the power readings I was able to track down, only for whatever missions the remaining widows and presumably occasionally Sergeant Barnes performed in those areas before being shut down until the next mission. 2 locations, however, were reclaimed and returned to continuous use. That will give us somewhere to start, at least, Phil said. Pepper nodded. I might be able to do something from my end, she said. Obviously, dealing with these people directly isn't my bailiwick, but if those locations are near SI offices or factories or belong to businesses we compete with, I can cause trouble from that angle. The situation is, I feel, more complicated than that, Jarvis said. I have succeeded in ascertaining the whereabouts of 5 of the personnel that Agent Romanoff was able to identify. One died in a car wreck. The further circumstances surrounding that incident lead me to believe that the person was assassinated by his own people. Apparently his usefulness had come to an end. The other 4 are still alive and presumably still active in Red Room's operations. But that is not the greatest problem, Jarvis said. In the course of pursuing information on the oldest of the persons on the list, I unearthed some very disturbing information that hinted at a larger, more global conspiracy. Further investigation led me to a most unexpected and unwelcome source, Jarvis said. Aha, now they were getting somewhere. This, Pepper knew, was the source of Jarvis's upset. Okay, so what's the bad news? Pepper asked. It is my unfortunate duty to report that Hydra is alive and well, Jarvis said. Well, Pepper hadn't been expecting that. Any number of things, but not that. How sure are you? Phil wanted to know. To his credit, the question wasn't, are you sure? Or could you be mistaken? Phil might not know exactly what Jarvis was capable of, but he knew that Jarvis was extremely impressive. The likelihood I am mistaken is less than 0.00001%, Jarvis said. It would seem that in the wake of the death of Johann Schmidt and Arnim Zola's capture, that Hydra went on the ground. Unfortunately, they seem to have learned from the mistakes that were made in World War II. I have been able to ascertain the existence, but not the precise placement, of agents in nearly every country around the globe. Further, the Red Room and Weapon X programs were both, ultimately, Hydra programs, carefully concealed behind multiple shell organizations. That got a severely pissed-off noise from Logan. Rather understandably, Pepper thought. He'd suffered unspeakable torture at the hands of the Weapon X program, even if he couldn't remember much of it. While I have not found proof, and may not, I suspect that, to some degree, Hydra was involved in Dr. Banner's troubles. Perhaps not the creation of Hulk, but the likelihood of them interfering after that point is high, due to their demonstrated interest in the serum, Jarvis said. Pepper was white-faced with horror. That means Hydra was responsible for Sergeant Barnes's situation, she said. And I can't even begin to hope that was accidental. Steve and James were too well known to them. Quite so, Jarvis agreed. Dibs on not telling Steve, Clint piped up. And I vote that we start finding where these cockroaches are hiding. We're going to need targets to aim him at. Agreed, Phil said, then actually sighed. Just a little. Just enough that Pepper noticed it, which was rather telling, given that Phil wasn't much for obvious displays of emotion. And I'll tell Steve when they get back.